Welcome back to G Fun Facts Online. Today we are diving deep into what was, for nearly 2 centuries, the holy grail of historical linguistics. We are talking about the origin of the Indo-European languages. This is the family that gave birth to English, Spanish, Russian, Hindi, Persian, and dozens of others. If you are listening to this, you are likely using a descendant of this ancient mother tongue right now. For decades, the question of who spoke this original language, known as Proto-Indo-European, and where they lived, was the subject of a bitter intellectual war. But in the last few years, and specifically through the breakthrough studies published in 2024 and 2025, that war has effectively ended. We now have an answer, and it did not come from digging up pottery shards or analyzing grammar alone. It came from a collision of 2 completely different fields, ancient DNA, known as paleogenomics, and advanced mathematics, known as linguistic phylogenetics. What they found paints a picture of human history that is more dynamic, more violent, and more mobile than we ever dared to imagine. So let us strip away the academic jargon and look at the raw data to understand how a group of nomadic pastoralists reshaped the world. To understand how this mystery was solved, we have to look at the tools. Traditional historical linguistics relies on the comparative method. This involves painstaking manual reconstruction of words. For example, linguists look at the word for mother in English, mutter in German, madre in Spanish, and matre in Sanskrit, and they deduce that they all come from a common ancestor. This method is brilliant, but it has a flaw. It is terrible at telling time. It can tell you that languages are related, but it cannot tell you when they split apart. This is where the revolution happened. Researchers began treating language like a biological organism. Just as DNA mutates at a predictable rate, which we call the molecular clock, words in a language are replaced over time. By using massive databases of these cognate words and applying Bayesian inference models, scientists repurposed algorithms designed to track the evolution of viruses, to track the evolution of words. These Bayesian models allow researchers to run millions of simulations to find the most likely family tree for these languages. In 2023, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology released a landmark study using a massive dataset of 161 languages. The computer models produced a hybrid tree that finally bridged the gap between the 2 dominant theories. It suggested that the ultimate root of the family lay south of the Caucasus Mountains around 8,100 years ago. But, and this is the massive pivot point, it showed a secondary explosive radiation of languages around 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, branching directly from the steppe. This linguistic timeline fit perfectly with the genetic data coming out of labs at Harvard and Copenhagen. The DNA told us that in the early Bronze Age, a massive migration occurred. The protagonists of this story are the Yamnaya culture. Before 2015, the Yamnaya were known mostly to specialists as the pit grave culture, named after their practice of burying their dead in pits under massive earthen mounds called kurgans. They appeared on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which is modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, around 3300 BCE. The Yamnaya represented a seismic shift in how humans lived. Unlike the farmers of old Europe, who lived in dense towns, the Yamnaya were mobile. They had domesticated the horse, initially for meat and milk, and crucially, they had the wheel. They used heavy, solid-wheeled ox wagons that allowed them to take their herds of cattle and sheep deep into the open grasslands. This mobility was their superpower. They were a patriarchy, obsessed with lineage and war, and they were physically robust, taller than the farmers they would soon replace. The linguistic reconstruction of their language, Proto-Indo-European, matches this archaeological reality perfectly. The vocabulary is full of words for wagon, axle, wheel, horse, and wool. It notably lacks words for warm climate crops, which rules out the idea that they came from the Middle East. The smoking gun for the Yamnaya theory arrived in 2015, when David Reich's lab at Harvard sequenced the genomes of the corded ware culture in central Germany, dating to about 2500 BCE. The results were shocking. They found that 75% of the ancestry of these individuals came directly from the Yamnaya. In a blink of evolutionary time, the genetic map of Europe had been wiped clean and repainted. The Yamnaya had not just migrated, they had swamped the continent. However, there was one massive problem that plagued this theory for years. It is called the Anatolian Puzzle. The Anatolian branch of Indo-European, which includes the language of the Hittites who ruled Bronze Age Turkey, is the oldest branch of the family. If the Yamnaya were the ancestors of all Indo-Europeans, the Hittites should have carried Yamnaya DNA. But when geneticists tested ancient samples from Turkey, they found 0 steppe ancestry. This discrepancy kept the rival Anatolian hypothesis alive. But the breakthroughs of 2024 and 2025 finally solved this paradox by identifying a ghost population. Geneticists and linguists realized that the Yamnaya themselves were a mixture. They were formed from the merger of Eastern European hunter-gatherers and a population from the Caucasus. The recent studies pinpointed a specific group living between the Volga River and the Caucasus Mountains around 4500 BCE. This group is now called the Caucasus Lower Volga, or CLV people. Here is the new timeline that solves the puzzle. Around 4500 BCE, the CLV population spoke pre-Proto-Indo-European. Around 4200 BCE, this population split. One group moved south, crossing the mountains into Anatolia. These people carried the ancestor of the Hittite language, but they moved before the genetic formation of the Yamnaya proper. This explains why Hittites speak an Indo-European language, but look genetically different. Meanwhile, the remaining population on the steppe mixed with northern hunter-gatherers to become the classic Yamnaya we know, speaking late Proto-Indo-European. It was this group, armed with wagons and a new social organization, that expanded explosively east and west around 3000 BCE. Let us look at that westward expansion first, because it created the Europe we know today. The expansion manifests archaeologically as the corded ware culture, which swept across northern Europe, starting around 2900 BCE. Linguistic Phylogenetics identifies this exact moment as the splintering of the northwest Indo-European branch. The mathematical models show a starburst pattern where Germanic, Celtic, Italic, and Balto-Slavic swiftly diverge. The relationship between the Yamnaya and Germanic languages is particularly direct. The corded ware culture in Scandinavia merged with local populations to produce the battle axe culture, which linguistically correlates with pre-Proto-Germanic. Interestingly, the Germanic languages preserve the trauma of this encounter. They contain a substrate of non-Indo-European words, mostly terms for sea life and local flora, suggesting that while the Yamnaya migrants imposed their language, they absorbed elements of the local tongue as they married into the population. Further south, the debate over whether Italic, the ancestor of Latin, and Celtic were once the same language, has also been settled. The Nutri support a single Italo-Celtic group that moved up the Danube Valley. This correlates with the Bell Beaker phenomenon. Ancient DNA shows that the Bell Beaker people, who were Yamnaya descendants, caused a 90% population replacement in Britain around 2400 BCE. The people who built Stonehenge were replaced by the speakers of Proto-Celtic almost overnight. Now, let us turn our gaze eastward, because the story there is driven by an even more terrifying technology, the chariot. The eastern wing of the Yamnaya expansion evolved into the Sintashta culture around 2100 BCE, located near the Ural Mountains. The Sintashta are universally identified as the speakers of Proto-Indo-Iranian. They were the first engineers to bend wood into spoked wheels, creating the light war chariot. This invention is encoded in the language itself. The Sanskrit words for axle and chariot have direct cognates in the oldest Iranian texts. From their industrial hub in the Urals, where they mined copper on a massive scale, these people expanded south. As they moved, they encountered the sophisticated Bactria Margiana archaeological complex in Central Asia. The linguistics showed that the Indo-Iranians borrowed specific words for irrigation, bricks, and camels from these city dwellers before splitting. One group went on to become the Iranians, and the other crossed the Hindu Kush into the Punjab to become the Indo-Aryans. The Rig Veda, the oldest Sanskrit text, describes this world of chariots and cattle raids perfectly. The 2025 data has rendered the old out-of-India theory untenable. Steppe ancestry in South Asia appears strictly in the Bronze Age and is highest in the priestly Brahmin caste, confirming that Sanskrit entered the subcontinent from the northwest. Even the lonely, outlier branches of the family have been explained. In the early 20th century, manuscripts were found in western China written in an unknown Indo-European language called Tocharian. It was baffling because it sounded like a European language, deep in Asia. Phylogenetics now places Tocharian as the second oldest branch to split, right after Anatolian. It is linked to the Afanasyevo culture, a group of Yamnaya who migrated thousands of kilometers east to the Altai Mountains around 3300 BCE, becoming isolated from the main group. They were the lost legion of the steppe. So why did these languages win? Why do 3.5 billion people today speak a daughter of the Yamnaya tongue? It was not just violence. It was a package of social and technological dominance. First, mobility. The wagon allowed them to manage larger herds and move resources faster than farmers could. Second, diet. Geneticists found the Yamnaya had a higher tolerance for milk, providing a portable, renewable calorie source that armies could run on. And third, a patron-client social system. The vocabulary of Proto-Indo-European implies a system of guest-host relationships and feasting obligations. To get ahead in Bronze Age society, you had to speak the language of the people with the big herds and the bronze axes. This synthesis of linguistic phylogenetics and ancient DNA has fundamentally altered our view of human history. We are not the static descendants of people who have lived on the same land for eternity. We are the products of massive, dynamic migrations. The Yamnaya were a keystone culture that unlocked the energy of the steppe. By marrying the probability of language change with the hard certainty of carbon-dated genomes, We have traced them from the Volga to the Atlantic and the Ganges. Every time you say the words mother, water, two, or three, you are breathing life into the echoes of a language spoken by nomads on the Russian steppe 5,000 years ago. The mystery is solved, but the wonder remains. Thanks for listening to G Fun Facts Online.